The scream tore through the mansion before the sun had even fully risen. Lily Voss collapsed on the marble floor of her bedroom, her body shaking, her lips turning pale blue. Her mother, Renata, dropped the tray she was carrying and rushed to her daughter's side, screaming for help. Within seconds, the hallway filled with footsteps, panic, and fear. Daniel Voss, a man whose name alone made grown men lower their eyes, stood frozen in the doorway. For the first time in years, the powerful figure who controlled half the shipping routes in the city felt something he had almost forgotten: fear, real, raw fear. He rushed to his daughter, lifted her small trembling body into his arms, and shouted for the family doctor. Within minutes, the private physician arrived, checked her pulse, her breathing, her eyes, and could not explain what was happening. Lily's temperature was normal. Her heart was beating fast, but there was no clear cause. She was not responding to questions. Her eyes rolled back for a moment before she regained consciousness, confused and weak. By the time the ambulance arrived, Daniel had already made calls to 3 different hospitals, demanding the best specialists money could buy. Within hours, doctors from the top hospitals in the region filled the private wing of his mansion, which had been converted into a temporary medical unit years ago, for exactly this kind of emergency. Machines were wheeled in, blood samples were taken, scans were ordered. Every possible test that modern medicine could offer was run on the 15-year-old girl, and yet, by evening, no one had an answer. Dr. Simon Blake, a well-known specialist flown in from the capital, stood in the hallway outside Lily's room, rubbing his temples. He had seen thousands of patients in his career, yet nothing matched what he was witnessing. Her symptoms did not fit any known illness. No infection, no poison in her blood work, no neurological damage visible on the scans. It was as if her body was reacting to something invisible, something that left no trace. Daniel stood across from him, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You are the best in the country," Daniel said, his voice low and controlled, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had shouted. "And you are telling me you don't know what is wrong with my daughter?" Dr. Blake swallowed hard. "Mr. Voss, I understand your concern, but medicine does not always have instant answers. We need more time, more tests. You have had all day. With respect, sir, some conditions take longer to diagnose." Daniel took a step closer. "My daughter does not have longer. Look at her." Through the open door, Lily lay on the hospital bed, her small frame connected to tubes and monitors, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Renata sat beside her, holding her hand, tears streaming silently down her face, refusing to let anyone see her break down completely. Dr. Blake lowered his eyes. "We will keep trying." Daniel turned away without another word and walked toward his study, his footsteps echoing through the long marble corridor. Everyone in the house had learned, over the years, that silence from Daniel Voss was far more dangerous than his anger. When he raised his voice, people knew where they stood. When he went quiet, no one knew what would happen next. In the kitchen, far from the chaos upstairs, a woman named Grace Ellison prepared a tray of tea for the visiting doctors. She was in her early 50s, with tired eyes that had seen more sorrow than most people twice her age. She had worked in the Voss household for almost 3 years, keeping to herself, doing her job quietly, never once stepping outside the boundaries expected of her position. She had heard the screaming that morning. She had seen the ambulance. She had watched, from a distance, as men in white coats rushed in and out of the house all day, their faces growing more troubled with each passing hour. As she carried the tray up the stairs, she paused near the open door of Lily's room. She could see the girl lying there, weak and pale, surrounded by machines that beeped steadily, but offered no real comfort. Something about the scene made Grace's chest tighten. It was not just sympathy, it was memory. She quickly looked away and continued down the hall, delivering the tray to the doctors gathered in the sitting room, who were now arguing quietly among themselves, flipping through file after file of test results that made no sense. "Her white blood cell count is completely normal," one doctor muttered. "No signs of any bacterial or viral infection," another added. "Then what is causing the seizures?" a third asked, frustration clear in his voice. Grace set the tray down without a word and turned to leave, but something made her hesitate at the door. She glanced back at the doctors, their faces buried in charts and numbers, completely certain that the answer had to be something complicated, something hidden deep within medical science. She thought of her own daughter, years ago, in a small village far from this grand mansion. She thought of the fear she had felt then, the helplessness, the doctors who had also been confused, who had also searched for answers that took too long to arrive. She pushed the memory away and returned to the kitchen, telling herself it was not her place to think about such things. She was the maid. She cleaned the floors, prepared the meals, and stayed out of matters that did not concern her. That was the arrangement that had kept her safe and employed for years. But as the night wore on, and Lily's condition did not improve, something inside Grace refused to stay quiet. By midnight, 2 more specialists had arrived, flown in urgently from another city at Daniel's command. They examined Lily, ran their own tests, and came to the same conclusion as the others. No clear diagnosis, no obvious cause. The girl's condition was stable for now, but no one could explain what had triggered the collapse, and no one could promise it would not happen again, perhaps worse the next time. Daniel paced the length of his study, a glass of untouched whiskey sitting on his desk. Marcus Doyle, his most trusted right-hand man, stood near the door, watching his boss with quiet concern. Marcus had worked alongside Daniel for over a decade, through business deals that were far from gentle, through conflicts that tested every ounce of loyalty, but he had never seen Daniel like this. Not the confident, commanding man who controlled everything around him, but a father, terrified and powerless. "The doctors say they need more time," Marcus said carefully. "I don't have more time," Daniel snapped. "She could have another attack tonight. Tomorrow, and they still don't know why the first one happened. We brought in the best people in the country. Then why does my daughter still not have an answer?" Daniel's voice cracked slightly, something Marcus had never witnessed before. He quickly composed himself, straightening his jacket, his expression hardening again. "Get me a list of every specialist in every hospital within 500 miles. I don't care what it costs." Marcus nodded and left the room immediately. Down in the kitchen, Grace sat alone at the small wooden table where the staff took their meals, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Margaret Lowe, the head housekeeper, entered and sat across from her, noticing the troubled look on Grace's face. "You look like you haven't slept," Margaret said gently. "I haven't," Grace admitted. "It's a terrible thing, what's happening to that poor girl." Margaret nodded sadly. "The doctors are baffled. I heard them talking. They've never seen anything like it." Grace's fingers tightened around her cup. "What exactly happened? Before she collapsed, I mean." Margaret shrugged. "From what I heard, she woke up complaining of dizziness, then her body just gave out. It happened so fast." Grace stayed quiet for a long moment, her mind working through details that seemed to matter more to her than to anyone else in the house. Margaret, noticing her silence, gave her a curious look but said nothing further, assuming exhaustion had simply taken hold of her. As the night stretched on, Grace found herself unable to sleep. She lay in her small room at the back of the mansion, staring at the ceiling, thoughts circling back again and again to a memory she had tried for years to bury. Her daughter, many years ago, had suffered from strange symptoms that no doctor in their small village could explain: dizziness, weakness, episodes that came without warning. The local doctors had run out of answers, blaming everything from stress to unknown infections. It was only later, too late for Grace's family, that someone had finally identified the true cause, something so simple that it had been overlooked by everyone searching for a complicated explanation. Grace closed her eyes, her chest aching with old grief. She told herself it was just a coincidence, just her exhausted mind connecting 2 unrelated tragedies. She was not a doctor. She had no right to interfere in a matter involving the most powerful and feared man in the city. But sleep would not come. Somewhere above her, in a room filled with machines and monitors, Lily Voss stirred weakly in her sleep, her small body still fighting whatever invisible force had taken hold of her. And somewhere in his study, Daniel Voss sat awake through the entire night, staring at his daughter's photograph on his desk, waiting for a phone call from anyone who might finally have an answer. None came. By morning, 3 more doctors had arrived at the mansion, adding to the growing crowd of medical experts who filled the halls with hushed, worried conversations. Grace moved through the house carrying trays, changing linens, and cleaning rooms, trying to focus on her work, trying to push away the thoughts that had kept her awake all night. But every time she passed Lily's door and glimpsed the pale, fragile girl lying beneath the tangle of medical wires, the memory of her own daughter grew stronger, refusing to be silenced. Something was wrong in this house. Something that had nothing to do with complicated diseases or rare conditions that required expensive machines to detect. And deep down, Grace was beginning to suspect she knew exactly what it was. By the third day, the mansion no longer felt like a home. It felt like a battlefield where an invisible enemy could not be found, let alone defeated. Lily had suffered 2 more episodes since the first collapse, each one leaving her weaker than before. The second attack had happened in the middle of the afternoon, while she was sitting up in bed trying to eat a small bowl of soup. Without warning, her hands had begun to shake violently. Her eyes had rolled back, and she had slumped sideways, unconscious before anyone could reach her. The third attack, just hours ago, had been the worst yet. Her lips had turned a faint shade of blue, and for nearly a full minute, she had stopped breathing before the emergency team managed to stabilize her. Daniel had not slept in 3 days. His eyes were rimmed with dark circles, his usually sharp and composed demeanor replaced by something raw and desperate. He had summoned every specialist within reach, spending amounts of money that would have made most people gasp, yet nothing had changed. If anything, his daughter was growing worse. In the sitting room that had become the doctor's command center, 6 specialists now gathered around a long table covered in charts, scans, and blood test results. Dr. Simon Blake stood at the head of the table, looking as exhausted as everyone else in the house. "We have ruled out every infectious disease known to affect someone her age," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "We have ruled out autoimmune conditions, neurological disorders, even rare genetic syndromes. Her organs are functioning normally between episodes. There is no explanation." "Could it be some kind of poisoning?" asked Dr. Nathan Price, a toxicologist who had been flown in the previous night. "We tested for over 200 known toxins," Dr. Blake replied. "Nothing showed up." "What about something not commonly tested for? An unusual substance? Something environmental?" "We would need to know what to look for," Dr. Blake said, rubbing his eyes. "Testing for everything that exists is simply not possible. We need a starting point, a clue, something that narrows the search." Daniel, who had been standing silently near the window listening to every word, finally spoke. "Then find a starting point. That is what I am paying all of you for." The room fell silent. No one had an answer. Marcus stepped forward carefully, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had learned long ago how dangerous it was to disappoint Daniel Voss. "Sir, perhaps we should consider bringing in a team from overseas. There are hospitals known for handling rare and unexplained cases." "How long would that take?" Daniel asked. 2 days, maybe 3, if we can arrange the fastest possible transport." Daniel's jaw tightened. She might not have 3 days. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared say what they were all quietly thinking, that without knowing the cause, they had no way of predicting how much time Lily truly had left. Daniel turned and walked out of the room without another word, his footsteps heavy and slow, nothing like the confident stride that usually carried him through the halls of his empire. He made his way to Lily's room and sat beside her bed, taking her small hand in his. She was sleeping, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, monitors beeping steadily beside her. "I will find whoever did this to you," he whispered, though he had no proof anyone had done anything at all. It was easier, in some strange way, to imagine an enemy he could hunt down and destroy than to accept that his daughter might simply be dying from something no one could explain or stop. Renata sat on the other side of the bed, her face pale and hollow from days of crying and sleeplessness. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes pleading. "Please, do something. Anything. I am trying," he said quietly. "I am trying everything I know how to do." But for the first time in his life, Daniel Voss felt completely powerless. All his wealth, all his influence, every connection he had built over decades of ruthless business dealings, none of it mattered in this room. None of it could save his daughter. Downstairs, Grace continued her work in near silence, her thoughts consumed by the same suspicion that had haunted her since the first night. She had spent the past 2 days paying close attention to small details around the house, things she doubted anyone else had bothered to notice. The pattern of when Lily's episodes occurred, what the girl had eaten or been near before each attack, the layout of her room, the items that had been recently added or changed. It was during her afternoon cleaning rounds that Grace noticed something odd. A new decorative item had been placed in Lily's room about a week before the first collapse. A beautiful antique piece that Renata had proudly shown off to visiting guests just days earlier. Grace remembered polishing the item herself when it first arrived, remembered how strange its scent had seemed at the time, faintly metallic, almost bitter. She had not thought much of it then. It was not her place to question the decisions of the family she served. But now, as she stood in the hallway near Lily's room, watching doctors pass by with worried faces and empty theories, the memory of that scent lingered in her mind with growing unease. She thought again of her daughter, so many years ago, in a small house that had none of the luxury surrounding her now. The doctors back then had also searched for complicated answers, running tests for diseases that did not exist in her daughter's body, while the true cause sat quietly in plain sight the entire time. By the time anyone discovered it, it had already been too late. Grace could not let that happen again. Not if there was even a small chance she could prevent it. But speaking up meant stepping far outside the boundaries she had lived within for years. It meant walking into a world of danger, wealth, and power that had never included people like her. Daniel Voss was not a man known for patience with those who overstepped their place. She had heard the whispers among the staff, stories of people who had crossed him and disappeared from both his household and, some said, from the city entirely. She did not know how much of it was true, but the fear it created was very real. That evening, as she carried a stack of clean towels toward the linen closet near Lily's room, Grace paused outside the door once more. Through the small gap, she could see Renata sitting beside her daughter, gently brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead, whispering words of comfort that the unconscious girl could not hear. Grace's chest tightened painfully. She continued walking, telling herself once again that it was not her place, that the doctors surely knew more than she did, that she was simply an exhausted woman, imagining connections that did not truly exist. But later that night, unable to sleep, she found herself walking quietly through the darkened halls of the mansion, drawn back toward Lily's room almost against her own will. The door was slightly open. Inside, a single dim lamp illuminated the room, and Renata had finally fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed, overcome by exhaustion. Grace stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the antique item resting on the shelf near the window, the very item she had noticed days earlier. In the quiet stillness of the night, she could almost imagine that faint, bitter scent reaching her from across the room. She stepped back into the hallway, her heart pounding. The following morning brought no improvement. Lily remained weak and pale, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep, her body seemingly fighting a battle that no one around her fully understood. The doctors gathered again, discussing new theories, ordering additional tests, their voices growing more strained with each passing hour. Daniel stood near the doorway of the makeshift medical room, watching the specialists work with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He had built an empire through sheer force of will, through decisions made quickly and decisively, through never once allowing himself to feel truly helpless. Yet here, in his own home, surrounded by the finest medical minds money could summon, he felt that helplessness consuming him entirely. Marcus approached him quietly. "Sir, the overseas team has agreed to come. They can be here within 36 hours. Daniel did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on his daughter's pale face through the open door. "Sir." 36 hours, Daniel repeated slowly. "And what happens if she has another attack before then? What happens if the next one is worse?" Marcus had no answer. Daniel turned away, walking down the hall with his fists clenched at his sides. He passed Grace, who was carrying a basket of laundry toward the utility room, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Grace quickly lowered her gaze, stepping aside to let him pass, her heart racing with thoughts she still could not bring herself to voice. As Daniel disappeared around the corner, Grace stood frozen in the hallway, the basket heavy in her arms, her mind replaying everything she had noticed over the past several days, the timing of the episodes, the new item in the room, the faint scent she could not forget. She thought of her daughter one final time, a memory so painful it had shaped every decision she had made in the years since. She remembered the helplessness of watching someone she loved suffer, while those with knowledge and authority searched in every direction except the right one. She would not let that happen again, not while there was still a chance to prevent it. Grace set down the laundry basket and stood in the quiet hallway, gathering every ounce of courage she possessed. Somewhere above her, machines beeped steadily beside a dying girl, and somewhere down the hall, a man capable of great and terrible things paced back and forth in helpless anguish. It was time to speak. Grace's hands trembled as she walked toward Daniel's study, her footsteps slow and deliberate on the polished marble floor. Every instinct told her to turn back, to return to her laundry and her quiet, unnoticed existence within the household. But something stronger than fear pushed her forward, a memory of grief so deep it had never fully healed. Two guards stood outside the study door, both of them tall, broad-shouldered men who worked directly for Marcus. They watched Grace approach with mild curiosity, unaccustomed to seeing kitchen staff anywhere near this part of the house. "I need to speak with Mr. Voss," Grace said, her voice steadier than she expected. One of the guards, a stocky man named Colin, raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About his daughter." Colin exchanged a glance with the other guard. "Mr. Voss is not seeing anyone right now. He's dealing with enough already." "Please," Grace said, her voice firm despite the pounding in her chest. "I believe I know what is making her sick." Colin let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're the maid, aren't you? I think the doctors upstairs might have that covered." "The doctors don't know," Grace replied, refusing to back down. "That's exactly the problem." The second guard, younger and less certain, glanced nervously toward the study door. "Colin, maybe we should—" "No," Colin interrupted sharply. "Mr. Voss does not need to be bothered by house staff with theories. Go back to your work." Grace stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had come this far, and turning back now felt impossible, as though she would be abandoning her own daughter all over again. "If something happens to that girl because no one would listen to me, I will not be able to live with myself. Please, 1 minute, that is all I am asking." Just as Colin opened his mouth to refuse again, the study door swung open. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression tired and hollow, clearly having heard raised voices outside his office. His eyes moved from the guards to Grace, narrowing slightly with confusion. "What is going on here?" Colin straightened immediately. "Sorry, sir. She insisted on speaking with you. I told her you were not to be disturbed." Daniel studied Grace for a long moment, recognition slowly forming on his face. He had seen her many times over the years, carrying trays, cleaning rooms, always quiet, always in the background. He could not recall ever exchanging more than a few words with her. "You work in my kitchen," he said finally. "Yes, sir," Grace replied, forcing herself to meet his eyes, despite every instinct urging her to look away. "My name is Grace. I have worked here for almost 3 years." "And you believe you know something about my daughter's condition that 6 specialist doctors do not?" The question hung in the air, heavy with disbelief and exhaustion. Grace felt her resolve wavering, the enormity of what she was doing pressing down on her like a physical weight. But she thought of Lily's pale face, of the machines beeping steadily beside her, of the precious time slipping away with every passing hour. "I believe I might, sir," Grace said quietly. "I am asking for 1 minute of your time. If I am wrong, I will return to my work and never speak of this again." Daniel stared at her, his exhausted mind trying to process the strangeness of the moment. Every rational part of him wanted to dismiss her immediately, to trust the credentials and expertise of the doctors he had spent a fortune summoning to his home. But something in Grace's eyes, a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deep and painful, made him hesitate. "Sir," Colin interjected, "I can have her escorted back to the staff quarters if you—" "Wait," Daniel said, raising a hand. The hallway fell silent. Daniel studied Grace for a long moment, weighing days of failed medical expertise against the unlikely possibility that a member of his household staff might see something everyone else had missed. He had built his entire life on trusting his instincts, on reading people quickly and accurately, and right now, every instinct told him that the woman standing before him was not driven by foolishness or attention, but by something far more sincere. "1 minute," he said finally. "Come with me." Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her, quickly followed by a fresh surge of nervousness. She followed Daniel down the hallway, past the guards who watched with obvious surprise, toward the makeshift medical wing, where the doctors continued their endless discussions. As they approached, Dr. Blake looked up from his charts, confusion crossing his face at the sight of the household maid walking beside Daniel Voss. "Mr. Voss, is everything all right?" "This is Grace," Daniel said simply. "She believes she may know something about Lily's condition." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Several of the doctors exchanged skeptical glances, clearly doubting that a kitchen maid could offer any meaningful insight after days of failed expert analysis. Dr. Price, the toxicologist, folded his arms with barely concealed irritation. "With respect, Mr. Voss, we have run every relevant test available. I am not sure what additional information a member of your household staff could provide." "She has 1 minute," Daniel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let her speak." The room grew quiet, all eyes turning toward Grace. She felt her hands trembling slightly, but she forced herself to remain calm, drawing on years of quiet strength that had carried her through her own darkest days. "A week before Lily first collapsed," Grace began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "A new item was placed in her room, an antique piece, given as a gift if I remember correctly." Renata, who had been sitting silently near her daughter's bed, looked up sharply. "The music box, from my sister." "Yes," Grace said. "I polished it myself when it arrived. I remember noticing a strange smell coming from it at the time. Faint, metallic, almost bitter. I did not think much of it then." Dr. Price raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "A smell from an antique object hardly constitutes medical evidence." "Please," Daniel said, silencing him with a sharp glance. "Continue, Grace." Grace nodded, gathering her thoughts. "I noticed that Lily's episodes seemed to happen most often in the afternoon and evening, times when she would likely be spending the most time in her room, resting or reading. I also noticed that on the days she felt slightly better, she had spent time outside in the garden or in other parts of the house." Dr. Blake leaned forward slightly, his earlier skepticism beginning to shift into cautious curiosity. "Go on." "Many years ago," Grace continued, her voice growing quieter, heavier with old grief, "I lost my own daughter to an illness that no doctor in our village could explain. She had similar symptoms: dizziness, weakness, sudden collapses that came without warning. The doctors searched for complicated diseases, ran test after test, found nothing. By the time someone finally discovered the true cause, it was too late to save her." The room fell completely silent. Even Dr. Price, who had been openly skeptical moments earlier, now looked at Grace with a different expression, something between sympathy and growing attention. "What was the cause?" Renata asked softly, tears already forming in her eyes. "An old lamp in her bedroom," Grace said. "Beautiful, antique, a gift from a relative, much like the music box in Lily's room. It contained a certain type of old paint, one that had not been used in newer items for decades, because of what it could do to a person's body over time, especially with prolonged exposure in a closed space." Dr. Price's expression shifted rapidly from skepticism to something closer to alarm. "Are you suggesting a heavy metal exposure? Something like an old lead-based compound?" "I do not know the medical terms," Grace admitted. "But I know the scent, I know the timing, and I know that the doctors searching for something complicated may be missing something that has been sitting quietly in that room the entire time." Dr. Blake turned quickly toward Daniel. "Mr. Voss, if there is any possibility of environmental toxic exposure from an object in her room, especially something old and unregulated, we need to test for it immediately. Certain heavy metal compounds would not necessarily show up in our standard toxicology screening, unless we specifically knew to look for them." Daniel's face had gone pale, his mind racing through the implications of what he was hearing. "You mean to tell me that this entire time, the answer might have been sitting in her bedroom?" "It is only a possibility," Dr. Blake said carefully. "But given how specific and detailed this observation is, and given that our standard tests have failed to identify a cause, I believe it warrants immediate investigation." Dr. Price was already moving toward the door. "I will have that item tested immediately. If Grace is correct, we are looking at a very specific and very treatable form of poisoning, one that would explain every symptom we have observed." The room erupted into sudden motion, doctors moving quickly to gather equipment, to prepare new tests, to finally chase a lead that felt more promising than anything they had uncovered in 3 exhausting days. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, staring at Grace with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something between disbelief and overwhelming hope. "You said 1 minute," he said quietly. "Yes, sir," Grace replied. "You spoke for less than that." Grace lowered her eyes. "I did not wish to take more of your time than necessary, sir." Daniel continued staring at her, the weight of the past 3 days pressing down on him with renewed intensity. If Grace was right, if this quiet woman who had worked in his kitchen for 3 years without ever once drawing attention to herself had truly identified something that 6 of the finest specialists in the country had missed, then everything he believed about power, wealth, and expertise was about to be turned completely upside down. "Stay close," he said finally. "I may need you again." Grace nodded silently, standing quietly at the edge of the room as the doctors rushed to test her theory, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fragile, desperate hope. Dr. Price moved quickly toward Lily's room, followed closely by 2 assistants carrying testing equipment that had been sitting unused for days, equipment designed to detect substances far beyond the standard toxicology panel they had already run multiple times without success. Daniel followed close behind, his usual composed stride replaced by something faster, almost frantic. Inside the room, Renata stood beside her daughter's bed, watching with wide, hopeful eyes as Dr. Price approached the antique music box sitting quietly on the shelf near the window. It was a beautiful piece, ornately decorated with delicate carvings and a small painted scene on its lid, the kind of item that looked entirely harmless, even charming, to anyone who did not know what to look for. "This was a gift from my sister," Renata said quietly. "She found it at an estate sale months ago. She thought Lily would love it because it plays a lullaby our mother used to sing to us." Dr. Price pulled on a pair of protective gloves before carefully lifting the item, turning it over in his hands, examining every surface with a magnifying instrument he had brought from his equipment bag. "How often has this been near Lily?" "It sits on that shelf," Renata said. "She likes to wind it up before bed, listen to the music as she falls asleep." Dr. Price's expression grew increasingly serious as he continued his examination. "The paint on this piece appears quite old, possibly original to whatever era it was crafted in. Certain older paints used pigments containing heavy metals, substances that were later banned once their dangers became widely understood. If this item has been degrading over time, releasing microscopic particles into the air, especially in an enclosed space like this bedroom, it could absolutely explain symptoms like Lily's. But she's not been eating the paint," Daniel said, confusion and desperation mixing in his voice. "How could something like that make her so sick?" "Exposure does not require ingestion," Dr. Price explained, still examining the item carefully. "Inhalation over time, especially in a room with limited ventilation, particularly during sleep, when the body is at rest for extended hours, can lead to gradual accumulation in the bloodstream. The symptoms often appear suddenly once levels reach a critical point, even though the exposure has been occurring slowly over days or weeks." Dr. Blake entered the room quickly, carrying a portable testing kit. "We need to test the air quality in this room immediately, along with a direct sample from the item itself." The room fell into a tense, focused silence as the doctors worked with swift precision, taking samples from the music box's surface, testing the air near the shelf where it had been sitting, cross-referencing their findings against Lily's most recent blood work. Daniel stood near the door, his hands clenched at his sides, watching every movement with an intensity that betrayed just how desperately he needed this theory to be correct. Grace remained quietly in the hallway outside, unwilling to intrude further into a space that was not hers, yet unable to walk away entirely from the situation she had set into motion. Margaret found her there a few minutes later, her expression a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. "I heard what happened," Margaret whispered. "You spoke directly to Mr. Voss?" Grace nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the door of Lily's room. "Grace, that's incredibly brave, or incredibly reckless. I'm honestly not sure which." "I couldn't stay silent," Grace said quietly. "Not when I might know something that could help." Margaret studied her friend's face carefully. "This is about your daughter, isn't it? The one you lost." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, unable to speak further. Inside the room, the tension continued to build as the doctors waited for their initial test results. Dr. Price stared intently at a small handheld device, watching numbers shift and stabilize on its digital display. After what felt like an eternity, though it had only been a few minutes, he looked up, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and alarm. "The readings are elevated," he said. "Significantly elevated, in fact." for a substance we would not normally expect to find in a modern household. This is consistent with old, degrading lead-based paint, likely used as a decorative element on antique items manufactured decades ago, long before such materials were banned for safety reasons. Renata gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The music box. We will need to run a more detailed blood test to confirm elevated levels in Lily's system directly, Dr. Blake added quickly. But given these initial findings, combined with the timeline of her symptoms and their correlation with time spent in this specific room, I believe we may finally have identified the true cause of her condition. Daniel felt something break loose inside his chest, a tangled mixture of overwhelming relief and burning anger. Relief that an answer had finally emerged after days of terrifying uncertainty. Anger that something so simple, so avoidable, had been allowed to nearly cost him his daughter's life, while some of the most expensive medical minds in the country searched in entirely the wrong direction. "Test her blood," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Immediately. The medical team moved quickly, drawing a fresh blood sample from Lily, who stirred weakly at the sensation but did not fully wake. The sample was rushed to a portable analysis unit that had been set up in an adjoining room, and the household fell into an agonizing period of waiting, every second stretching unbearably as everyone hoped, prayed, and feared what the results might reveal. Grace remained in the hallway, joined now by several other staff members who had heard whispers of what was happening, all of them standing in tense, hopeful silence. Word had spread quickly through the household that the quiet kitchen maid had somehow stepped forward with an idea that the doctors themselves had missed entirely, and the mansion buzzed with a strange mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Dr. Blake emerged from the testing room, a printed report clutched in his hand, his expression difficult to read. Renata close behind, both of them searching his face desperately for any sign of what the results might mean. "Well?" Daniel demanded. Dr. Blake held up the report, his voice steady but filled with quiet astonishment. "Lily's blood shows significantly elevated levels of the exact substance we suspected. This confirms it. Her body has been slowly absorbing this toxin over the past several weeks, likely through inhalation while sleeping in close proximity to that item. The sudden episodes we witnessed were her body's reaction as the levels finally crossed a critical threshold." Renata began sobbing, relief and horror crashing over her simultaneously. Daniel stood frozen for a long moment, processing the enormity of what he was hearing. "Can you treat it?" he finally managed to ask. "Yes," Dr. Blake said firmly. "Now that we know exactly what we are dealing with, treatment is very achievable. We will begin a targeted therapy immediately to help her body eliminate the toxin from her system. Combined with removing the source of exposure entirely, I am confident we will see significant improvement within the next 24 to 48 hours. The relief that swept through the room was almost physical in its intensity. Renata rushed back to her daughter's bedside, gently stroking her hair, whispering words of comfort and hope, now backed by something real, something concrete, rather than the desperate uncertainty of the previous days. Daniel remained standing near the doorway, his mind still struggling to fully absorb everything that had just happened. Days of failed expertise, endless tests, specialists flown in from across the country. None of it had produced the answer that a quiet, unassuming maid had offered within the space of a single minute. He turned and walked slowly toward the hallway, where Grace still stood among the small group of gathered staff members, her expression anxious, waiting to learn whether her intervention had truly made a difference, or whether she had simply added false hope to an already devastating situation. Their eyes met across the hallway, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You were right," Daniel finally said, his voice quiet, almost unrecognizable compared to the commanding tone he usually carried. Grace felt tears welling in her own eyes, relief crashing over her in waves. "I am so glad, sir." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his eyes, some fundamental recalculation of everything he thought he understood about the people around him, about power, about worth, about who truly deserved his attention and respect. 3 days, he said quietly. 6 specialists, countless tests, and you solved it in less than 60 seconds. Grace lowered her eyes, uncertain how to respond to the weight of his words. "Come with me," Daniel said. "I want to understand exactly how you knew." Grace followed him slowly down the hallway, her heart still pounding, unaware that the events of the following hours would change not only Lily's fate, but her own life entirely. Daniel led Grace into a small sitting room adjacent to his study, a space rarely used except for private conversations that required more comfort than the formal atmosphere of his office allowed. He gestured toward a chair, and Grace sat down carefully, still unaccustomed to being treated as anything other than household staff within these walls. He remained standing for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite interpret, before finally taking the seat across from her. "Tell me about your daughter," he said quietly. Grace's hands folded tightly in her lap, old grief rising to the surface once again. Her name was Mira. She was 11 years old when she first started showing symptoms similar to Lily's: dizziness, sudden weakness, episodes that came without warning and left her exhausted and frightened. What happened? The doctors in our village searched for weeks, testing for infections, for parasites, for every illness they could think of. None of it matched what she was experiencing. By the time someone finally noticed the old lamp in her room, the same kind of antique piece with old paint, that had been slowly poisoning her, it was already too late. Her body had absorbed too much. Daniel's expression darkened with quiet sorrow. "I am sorry." "It was a long time ago," Grace said softly, though the pain in her voice suggested the wound had never truly healed. "I could not save Mira, but when I saw Lily lying in that bed, when I noticed the pattern with the music box, I could not stay silent. Even if it meant risking everything, I had to try." Daniel leaned back in his chair, processing the depth of sacrifice behind Grace's courage. She had walked into a confrontation with one of the most feared men in the city, fully aware of the risks, driven entirely by the memory of a daughter she could no longer save, hoping only to prevent another family from experiencing the same devastating loss. "3 years you have worked in my home," he said slowly, "and I never once took the time to know your story." Grace remained silent, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected admission, from a man known throughout the city for his ruthlessness, rather than his introspection. "My entire life," Daniel continued, "I have surrounded myself with people I believe to be the best doctors, the best lawyers, the best security. I built an empire on the belief that expertise and power were the only things that truly mattered in this world. And yet here we are, my daughter's life saved not by any of that, but by a woman I walked past in these halls for years without ever truly seeing." "You could not have known, sir," Grace said gently. "That is precisely the problem," Daniel replied, his voice heavy with something close to shame. "I never thought to ask." A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Dr. Blake appeared in the doorway, his expression brighter than it had been in days. "Mr. Voss, Lily is showing early signs of improvement already. Her vital signs are stabilizing, and she has regained consciousness. She is asking for her mother." Daniel rose immediately, relief flooding through him so intensely that for a moment he had to steady himself against the back of his chair. "Take me to her." He turned back toward Grace before leaving the room. "Come with me." Grace hesitated. "Sir, I do not think it is my place." "It is exactly your place," Daniel said firmly. "You saved her life. You will see the results of what you did." They walked together down the hallway, past staff members who watched with quiet astonishment as the household maid walked beside Daniel Voss, as though she belonged there entirely. Inside Lily's room, Renata sat on the edge of the bed, tears of joy streaming down her face, as her daughter, weak but conscious, looked up at her with tired, questioning eyes. "Mama," Lily whispered. "What happened?" "You're going to be all right," Renata said, kissing her daughter's forehead gently. "You're going to be just fine." Daniel approached the bed slowly, his hand reaching out to gently touch his daughter's arm, as if needing physical confirmation that she was truly awake, truly improving, truly safe. Lily managed a weak smile at the sight of her father, and something in Daniel's chest that had been clenched tight for 3 agonizing days finally began to loosen. He turned to look at Grace, who stood quietly near the doorway, watching the scene with tears in her own eyes. "Come here," he said. Grace approached hesitantly, and Daniel gestured toward Lily. "This is Grace. She is the reason you are going to recover." Lily looked up at the unfamiliar woman with weak but curious eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion, unable to find adequate words to respond, simply nodding and offering a gentle smile in return. Over the following 2 days, Lily's condition improved steadily, exactly as Dr. Blake had predicted. The color returned to her cheeks, her strength gradually came back, and the terrifying episodes that had gripped the household in fear did not return. The antique music box was removed from the mansion entirely, along with several other older decorative items that were tested and found to contain similar risks, precautions taken to ensure nothing like this could threaten the family again. News of what had happened spread quickly, not just through the household staff, but eventually through Daniel's wider circle of associates and business contacts. The story of how 6 of the country's most respected medical specialists had failed to identify a life-threatening condition that a household maid solved within a single minute became a quiet source of both astonishment and humility among those who heard it. Daniel, a man rarely known for public displays of gratitude, found himself unable to simply return to business as usual. He summoned Grace to his study one final time, this time not out of desperation or fear, but out of a genuine desire to properly honor what she had done. "I have thought carefully about how to repay what you did for my family," he said, standing behind his large desk, Grace seated respectfully across from him. "No amount of money could ever truly measure the value of Lily's life, but I intend to try regardless." He slid a folder across the desk toward her. Inside were documents detailing a significant financial settlement, along with the deed to a small but comfortable home in a quiet part of the city, completely paid for, and free of any debt or obligation. Grace stared at the papers, stunned into silence. "This is too much, sir," she finally managed to say. "It is not nearly enough," Daniel replied firmly, "but it is a start." He continued, his voice softening slightly. "I would also like to offer you a new position within my household, one that reflects your true value rather than simply your previous duties. If you are willing, I would like you to oversee the well-being of my family directly, ensuring that the kind of oversight that nearly cost us everything never happens again." Grace looked up at him, overwhelmed by the weight of everything unfolding before her. "I would be honored, sir." Daniel nodded, extending his hand toward her, a gesture of genuine respect rather than mere formality. Grace shook it firmly, feeling for the first time in years that her years of quiet suffering, of grief, carried silently through countless lonely nights, had finally led towards something meaningful. Word of what happened within the Voss household eventually reached even those outside the family's immediate circle. Business associates who had dealt with Daniel for years, men accustomed to his sharp, commanding presence, noticed a subtle shift in him following the incident, a quieter thoughtfulness that had not been there before. At a gathering several weeks later, one of his closest associates, a man who had worked alongside him for over a decade, asked him directly about the events that had transformed his household. 6 specialists, the associate said, shaking his head in disbelief. "And your maid solved it in a minute? I have to say, Daniel, that is a story I never expected to hear about you." Daniel, standing near the window with a glass in hand, remained quiet for a long moment, his expression distant and thoughtful. "There is nothing more to say," he finally replied, his voice carrying a weight that silenced any further questions on the matter. The room fell quiet, the associate sensing that whatever pride or ego might have once driven Daniel to dismiss such an admission had been replaced entirely by something far more humbling. The Mafia boss, feared throughout the city for his ruthlessness and his commanding presence, had nothing further to add. He simply nodded once, turned back toward the window, and allowed the silence to speak for itself. In the weeks that followed, Lily made a full recovery, returning to her studies, her friendships, and the ordinary joys of adolescence that had briefly been stolen from her. Grace settled into her new role within the household, her quiet strength and careful attention now recognized and valued in ways she had never imagined possible. And within the walls of a mansion that had once nearly lost everything to an invisible threat hiding in plain sight, a lesson remained, quietly understood by everyone who had witnessed those terrifying days. True wisdom did not always come dressed in expensive degrees or years of formal training. Sometimes, it came quietly, humbly, carried by someone who had simply learned, through unbearable loss, to notice what others overlooked entirely. And sometimes, that quiet wisdom was enough to change everything.